Okay, so our final PowerPoint on Unit 2, AC 4.3, and this one's entitled Discuss How Campaigns Affect Policy Making. So, what do we mean by this assessment component? Well, campaigns often aim to affect policy making by changing the law to create a new criminal offence, for example. And campaigns can be led by newspapers, a lone individual, or by pressure groups. So in this topic, we're going to look at some examples of how campaigns from each of these three categories have affected policy making. Now, you'll have done quite a bit of this on Unit 1, but nevertheless, it comes up in the exam in Unit 2. So hopefully the campaigns that I'm referring to, you'll have a little bit of knowledge of. Even if you don't, we're going to go back over those anyway, and that will also help you with your Unit 1 work as well. So when we're looking at how a campaign has influenced policy making, there are 5 points that you need to cover for the purposes of the exam. So for each campaign, you need to be considering what the campaign is about, how and why it started. You need to identify who the key parties were involved, who were they. You need to show how the campaign tried to change policies and laws, in other words, its methods. You need to show how it changed people's views or altered their opinions. And you also need to know the actual law or policies it introduced if successful. Now, this is probably the most important aspect of your answer. And so it's really important you can show the impact of the law and the policy. And another exam tip here for you, know the exact name of the law and policy. Quite often in the high mark evaluation questions, you cannot get maximum marks unless you actually give the precise name of the act or the law. And I've done that in every single one of these. So please make sure that you do that in your answers because you will get more marks. So without further ado, let's kick off with newspaper campaigns, and we're going to look at what's known as Sarah's Law, but the proper word for that is the Child Sex Offender Disclosure Scheme, which was brought in 2011. So what was the campaign about? Well, hopefully you know this anyway, but we'll just have a recap. In 2000, Sarah Payne, who was 8 years old, was abducted and murdered by this man here, Roy Whiting. He had previously been jailed in 1995 for kidnapping and indecently assaulting a 9-year-old girl, and his name had been placed on the sex offenders register. On a trip to visit family, Sarah's parents allowed her and her siblings to play by themselves, which was when Whiting abducted her. And the key bit here is the family said if they had known that Whiting had been in the area, they would have taken steps to protect Sarah. In other words, they never let her go out to play unattended. So the key parties involved, well, obviously Sarah's parents, Sarah and Michael, were involved. They demanded changes that would be more protective of Great Britain's children. The Paynes then joined forces with a leading tabloid newspaper, the News of the World, to campaign for life prison terms for child killers and public access to identifying information on Great Britain's 110,000 registered sex offenders. And the campaign became known as Sarah's Law, although it is effectively the law that was passed is the Child Sex Offenders Disclosure Scheme. Now, the other thing you might need to consider here, a couple of things. The News of the World is no longer with us. That paper no longer exists. And the other key thing is, that was what the campaign was about. Did they get all of that? The answer is actually no, they didn't. For instance, they did not get life prison terms for child killers. And what we mean by life prison terms, they were campaigning for life without parole, which is not the case. Right, the News of the World, just so you know, was published every Sunday. It was a Sunday paper, and that had a readership in the year 2000 of about 4 million people a week. So the highest selling Sunday paper. And its sister paper, The Sun, its daily readership was about 3.5 million. So the campaign had the backing of the 2 papers that had the highest readership in the country. So it got out to a lot of people. So what were they trying to change in terms of policies and laws? Well, obviously, utilising its formidable resources and with obviously broad public support, the News of the World launched a petition drive demanding public access to longer sentences for convicted sex offenders. And here is, one of their headlines. There are 110,000 child sex offenders in Britain, one for every square mile. The murder of Sarah Payne has proved police monitoring these perverts is not enough, so we're revealing who they are and where they are starting today. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. So the News of the World then published the photographs and addresses of 50 known sex offenders, and this ignited vigilante reprisals despite appeals against violence. And the paper promised to continue until it had revealed the identity of every paedophile in Britain. So what the News of the World said is, just like here, we're going to give you 50 names and addresses of paedophiles, and we're going to keep going every week until we have published all 110,000 of them. In other words, what they were trying to do was give the public access to the list of paedophiles via the back door. Now, worth considering this bit, okay, this main feature was that every week the News of the World would itself publish the names, photographs and approximate addresses of 50 quote-unquote convicted paedophiles. And here we see again, campaign for the petition, and more names and photographs of child sex offenders living near you, with an urgency to join our campaign. Now, in reality, this part of the campaign only lasted 2 weeks before the paper gave in to government and police demands to end it, because what happened as a result of the publication of these names was a huge welter of vigilante attacks and riots. So masses of people took to the streets and went round to the supposed addresses of the News of the World had published. Now, partly because of the low quality of the photos and the imprecision of the addresses, and back to the fact that mobs are not the most controlled people and they're careless, most of the attacks that happened were against people who were not even those the paper had named, but had similar names to them and looked a bit like them. So innocent people were being targeted by vigilante mobs. And the most notorious incident was when a paediatrician a doctor that looks after children, was driven from her home because paediatrician sounds a bit like paedophile. And I've given you the link to the Guardian report on that if you wish to have a look at that. So it failed in some ways. The naming of the paedophiles only lasted for 2 weeks, but the newspaper and Sarah's parents continued with the campaign, continued getting petitions, etc. And again, 700,000 people eventually signed the petition. But in 2001, the government turned down Sarah's law, but they did up their game a bit and instead introduced compulsory registration and set up what's called the Multi-Agency Public Protection Agreements, which is known as MAPA, with the police and the probation service to manage sex offenders released into the community. Well, that was all well and good, but then in 2003, the murder of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman sparked renewal of the News of the World campaign, again campaigning for sex offenders to be known, but ministers again turned down this public disclosure of sex offenders register and instead stepped up the vetting of those people that were working with children. So gradually the law is being made stiffer, made firmer, but the campaign hasn't yet got what it wanted. Then we move to 2006. This is the Craig Sweeney case. Here he is. Craig Sweeney kidnapped and sexually abused a 3-year-old girl despite being subject to a MAPA. And that revived the whole News of the World campaign, because they said, well, the government's bought in these changes, but clearly they're not working because Craig Sweeney has got away with it. So that then prompted Home Secretary John Reid to send a government minister, Jerry Sutcliffe, to the USA to study Megan's Law. And Megan's Law is basically the same as Sarah's Law, but it had been brought in earlier in the USA. And this was due to this little girl here, 7-year-old Megan Kanker, from Hamilton, New Jersey, who was raped and murdered by her neighbour in '94. The parents fought to have a law passed that would inform communities of sex offenders living among them, and Megan's Law was passed within months of her murder and was later adopted by numerous other states. And that's the man that did the crime, sentenced to death for the 1994 murder and rape of Megan Kanker. However, the death penalty was abolished in New Jersey in 2007, so he's escaped that. But nevertheless, Megan's Law came in the USA. Clare's Law is the British version of Megan's Law. So off went Jerry Sutcliffe to the USA to have a look at how that had been implemented. So what was happening now was the government was starting to change its views. Too many kids had died, things weren't working, maybe there was a time for Clare's Law to be introduced. So that's what happened. But they started with a pilot scheme. It was introduced into 4 areas of the UK in 2008 to allow parents to make inquiries about named individuals. The police would then reveal details confidentially to the person most able to protect the child, which obviously is usually the parent, but only if the police consider it to be in the best interests of the child. And by 2011, that pilot had proved successful, and therefore it was extended to cover the whole of England and Wales, and that is when the Child Sex Offender Disclosure Scheme was introduced. So in reality, anyone can ask the police if someone in contact with a child has a record of a child sex offence, but, and this is the key bit, the police are not obliged to disclose information and will only do so if they judge that the child is at risk of harm and the disclosure is necessary to protect the child. Since it's been introduced, in the first year, 700 paedophiles were identified under the scheme following requests in the first year, but the average is about 1 in 7 applications were successful. So 1 in 7 the police would actually let people know within the first year. And if you want more data, if you click on this link here, it will give you the number of disclosure scheme inquiries, applications that there have been by year, by police force, and you can have a look at that at your leisure. And it gives you an idea of how successful the campaign's been. So have they got mandatory life sentences, well, whole life terms for paedophiles? No, they haven't. Obviously, if a paedophile murders someone, it's a mandatory life sentence, but obviously you're eligible for parole. Can anyone see whether a sex offender is living in their neighbourhood? Well, they can ask, but 1 in 7 are only successful. So the law has changed, but how successful, that's up for you to make a decision on that. So there's an example of a newspaper campaign that successfully brought about a change to the law. So if we then look at individual campaigns, we're now going to look at Clare's Law. That is known as the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, brought in 2014. Again, refer to it as the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, the DVDS. That gets you more marks. So what the campaign was about, well, this lady here, Claire Wood, was murdered at the age of 36 by this man here, George Appleton, an ex-boyfriend in Salford near Manchester in February 2009. Although the relationship ended in 2004, Appleton had continued to harass her, and he eventually strangled and burned Wood's body before killing himself several days later. Now, Appleton had seriously abused women in the past, and the Greater Manchester Police were aware of his violent history. He'd served 3 prison sentences before he even went out with Wood, so he had 6 months for failure to comply with a restraining order, 2 years for harassment, and 6 years for holding a woman at knife point for 12 hours. Now, following Claire Wood's death, her family stated she would not have entered into the relationship with Appleton had she known of his violent past. You know, if you'd known that this bloke had done all these things, would you go out with him? And their argument was, no, of course she wouldn't have done. But she didn't know that because there wasn't a facility to know that. So the campaign is all about letting people have that facility. So who were the key parties involved? Well, it was this guy, this individual, Claire's father, Michael Brown. He'd had strong misgivings about the relationship, but he also was unaware of Appleton's history. And after Claire's death, Michael Brown discovered that his daughter had made several complaints to Greater Manchester Police, alleging that after the relationship ended, Appleton had been harassing and threatened to kill and try to rape her, but the police hadn't taken any action. And then it all emerged that Appleton had previously been jailed for harassing another woman and breaching a restriction order, and was said to have kidnapped an ex-girlfriend at knife point and had trawled the internet for women. So it all kicked off. And the inquest actually had to wait for 26 months while Claire's death and the police's failures were fully investigated. And at its conclusion, the coroner wrote to the Home Office asking why Claire hadn't been informed of Appleton's past. So the recommendation from the coroner at the inquiry to the Home Office, which is the part of the government that deals with crime and the laws, was, well, why didn't she know this bloke had all these things in the past? And obviously Michael Brown, Claire's dad, was appalled that this violent past had not been more openly known, and started his campaign after discovering abusive partners such as Appleton could hide between a loophole in the data protection law, which is, your data is safe, no one has a right to know your data. And Michael Brown was saying, well, this is ridiculous. If you've got these sort of things on your record, we need to know about it. But there was a loophole. And Brown was aided by Michelle Livesey, chief reporter at Radio Key 103 in Manchester, and local MP Hazel Blears in raising the issue. And here you see, so you've got Michael Brown there, you've got Michelle Livesey here, the radio presenter, and this is the MP, local MP Hazel Blears, and that's Michael Brown's partner, and that is Claire's brother, Adam. Okay, outside number 10 Downing Street, petitioning the government. So Brown campaigned to create legal means for the police to warn potential targets of abuse of their partner's violent pasts. So he attended the House of Parliament to explain his campaign, and Hazel Blears, the MP, introduced it into Parliament, where it gained huge support from MPs. At the same time, the Association of Chief Police Officers also backed the campaign, and the media assisted in raising the profile of the campaign. Here's an example from the Lancashire Post, where another family who've lost a partner lost someone due to an abusive partner is backing the campaign for the law. And obviously, women's groups supported the campaign and also helped to raise the profile of the campaign. And here's a very good quote from Hazel Blears. This is a clip of her speaking in the House of Commons. And she says, women in Claire's situation are often unaware of their partner's previous relationships. And this can mean they start a relationship with someone with no idea if they have a violent past. Claire's tragic death shows how vulnerable women aren't always protected under the current law. And until women are given the right to know if their partner has a history of serial domestic abuse, they can't be sure of the risk they face. By changing the law, we can empower women so that they can take informed action about their relationship and give them the chance to protect themselves and prevent domestic abuse from happening before it begins. And that, in a nutshell, is what the campaign is trying to do. That's what it is. And of course, the campaign raised the profile of issues surrounding domestic abuse and, of course, the failings of the police to address that issue. It highlighted the legal loophole that people agreed needed to be closed. And due to the fact that it had widespread support from the police, the government, the media, the public, it had every chance of being successful. So after all this petitioning and pressure, the law changed. It bore fruit. His campaign, Michael's campaign, bore fruit in 2013. Once again, very similar to what we've looked at previously. The government introduced a pilot scheme in 4 police areas, and that was successful. And so in 2014, the Domestic Violent Disclosure Scheme, the DVDS, was rolled out across all 43 police forces in England and Wales. So what you see there is both Sarah's Law and Clare's Law. They introduced a pilot scheme for both, and then when it was successful, out it rolled fully. And the DVDS sets out two procedures the police can use in disclosing information about an individual's previous violent and abusive offending to their partner. So you now have the right to ask, which allows a member of the public to apply to the police to disclose information. And they can ask about their own partner or the partner of someone they know. And you also have the right to know, which allows the police to disclose information to protect a potential victim, even without having been asked to do so. So that puts the onus on the police if they think a potential victim needs to be informed and they haven't asked. So it works both ways. So here's the headline from one of the papers when this came out. So, as I've said, the police are now obliged to disclose information, and they will meet with safeguarding agencies such as the probation service, prison or social services to decide whether disclosure is necessary to protect the person in question. And they also decide who should receive the information, and they will set up a safety plan for the potential victim. Since the scheme began, there have been many disclosures. For example, in 2018, 6,496 right to ask requests were made and 2,575 were granted, so an average of 40%. So the scheme is working. However, there are big differences between police forces. So, for example, Cumbria Police disclosed information in 96% of cases, while Bedfordshire Police did so in only 7%. So critics say this is justice by geography. But part of the reason for such differences has been different levels of knowledge and training for the scheme in different forces. And as that scheme and the training is rolled out, things are getting better. So there's an example of an individual campaign, Clare's Law, which leads us on to our final section, which is pressure group campaigns. And I've chosen Protection Against Stalking, which is linked to the Protection of Freedoms Act of 2012. So what was it all about? Well, in 2011, the campaign group PASS, Protection Against Stalking, launched a campaign to introduce a new law making stalking a specific offence. Now, at that point, the existing law, which was the 1997 anti-harassment law, didn't actually refer to stalking at all. So stalking was not technically viewed, or could be not technically viewed, as a crime. And one estimate put the numbers of victims of stalking at about 120,000 a year. And in some cases, it's quite obvious that stalking leads to physical attacks and even death. And I'm going to look at this case in more detail. Claire Bernal was shot dead by her stalker in 2005 while she was working in the Harvey Nichols London department store. Her killer had been due in court the following week for harassing her. So we'll look at that. There's the headline for it. And actually, he shot her and then shot himself in Harvey Nick. So there's his body lying there having shot himself. That is the headline. So let's look at that in more detail. So this is Claire Bernal, and this is her murderer. I can't remember his first name. Petch is his surname. She was shot dead by former boyfriend in the Harvey Nichols store in Knightsbridge in September 2005. He began stalking her after their 3-week relationship had ended. He was following her in the street, pestering her with phone calls, standing outside her house, bombarding her with text messages. One day he followed her from her workplace to London Bridge Station, where he pushed her in the back and told her, "If you dare report me, I will kill you." And on another occasion, "If I can't have you, nobody will." Now, the police arrested him for breaking a restraining order and prosecuted him on a charge of harassment. So whilst he was awaiting sentencing, he went back home to his home country, Slovakia, purchased a gun, and on Tuesday, the 13th of September, 10 minutes before closing time, he entered Harvey Nichols' store, walked up behind Claire, shot her in the head 4 times, and then turned the gun on himself. So there is the evidence that PASS were using to campaign for stalking being made a crime, a specific crime. So what it's about, well, the way the police were dealing with stalking, PAS argued, was inadequate and haphazard. They lacked a clear policy. Investigations were often left to individual officers' discretion, and victims weren't being taken seriously. There were only 70 prosecutions in 10 years under the 1997 Act. 70, 7 a year, with 120,000 possible cases. Who were the key parties involved? Well, it was Protection Against Stalking, a national charity that works within communities to raise public awareness about stalking and support victims of stalking through providing support services. And they're part of a national consortium of specialist stalking charities who share best practice. AAS is another example of a stalking charity. If you want to have a look at their specific work, there is the link to their website, well worth a read. So PAS concluded that the existing law wasn't fit for purpose. It was supported by NEPO, which was a prison officers union, and what PAS did was they set up an independent parliamentary inquiry, and they persuaded MPs and peers, members of the House of Lords, from all parties to serve on it. The inquiry lasted several months, hearing evidence from victims and their relatives, including mothers whose daughters had been killed by stalkers. They listened to academic experts, lawyers, police, probation officers. And the inquiry started to hear about the intimidation, fear and psychological and physical harm stalkers inflict, and about the inadequate responses of the authorities. And this is the results of the inquiry, and if you want to read it, you can follow that link and that will give you everything. So what happened? Well, the campaign succeeded in getting the law changed for several reasons, because the inquiry allowed the voices of victims to be heard, as well as those from frontline practitioners and support organisations. They gained support from a wide range of important organisations and groups. They kept the campaign in the public eye through press releases to the media. They lobbied individual MPs and peers who could actually change the law. And they gained support from all political parties. So the inquiry's report was published in February 2012 with the support of 60 MPs and peers. The Police Federation, the Magistrates Association also threw their weight behind it. PAS were able to get support from MPs to include an amendment to a bill that was going through Parliament, and this then became the Protection of Freedoms Act in April 2012. So that made stalking a criminal offence. And since that has become law, in 2019 to 20, remember it was 70 prosecutions in 10 years, a record 2,288 stalking charges were brought in 2019 to 20, more than double the number 5 years previously. Hopefully you've found that informative. That concludes all my ACs for Unit 2. My Unit 4 ones are there. Good luck in your exams, folks. Take care.